Hello and welcome everyone to another wonderful video brought to you by FM Daniel Wrench via Chess.com. And today we are concluding our series on the principle of two weaknesses. Yay! No more Danny for a while. Great. Yeah. No, just joking. Seriously though. Alright, well, this is our bonus video, as we call, and I call it the bonus video because you could probably categorize this particular endgame, which I think is a really instructive endgame and really interesting. We're going to cover a lot of different important ideas, including focusing mainly on the contrasting styles of the bishop and the knight, which I always liked because I always felt like there was a limited amount of material on knights and bishops and when they play against each other. You can find a lot on bishops and opposite code bishop endings, and a lot of times with the knights and how they contrast against each other. But the bishop versus knight, I think there are some beliefs out there and some myths out there that aren't necessarily true, and there are some that are out there but aren't necessarily emphasized about how important they really are. And that's kind of what I want to talk about. And of course, we're talking about the theme of principle to weaknesses, and that's what we're going to start with is exactly what our mindset should be when we're trying to convert a small advantage, and trying to take the time to recognize what the possible second weakness is. Here, it's actually, I've given this position to players that are roughly 1800 and better who've misevaluated who's better in this endgame, believe it or not. So I guess I'll ask you to ask yourself real quick, who do you think is better? And, make a decision in your mind real quick, so I'm about to tell you the answer. But white is better here. In fact, white is much better. Despite having this awkwardly placed bishop, you might say, on c2, where normally we don't like it when our bishop is blocked by all of our pawns, and this knight is such a beautiful beast here, hitting the c4 pawn, and we all know how well the knight does in blockading positions, and indeed that is true. That is a myth that is not... That is a myth that is not overrated. In fact, I guess it's not a myth. It is true. The knight does very well in positions of blockading. However, what's interesting to note is that just blockading a passed pawn without any other pieces to bring in to target that anchor. For example, you might recognize a structure like this from some variations of the Nimzo Indian, where black will actually, bring the other knight around the board somehow, to get it to a place where maybe at some point it could come here to a5 and take really long maneuvering journey trips so that both pieces can attack a weakness. That's an example of a knight. But even without a knight, other pieces could come here and attack this pawn. And if that is the case, then the blockading beast on d6 is indeed a very, very good piece. However, the problem is without any other targets, without any other ability to increase that pressure, the knight is only doing what we first said it was doing. It's blockading. Well, blockading is what? It's a defensive word. You're blockading, and that means that white is better because he is the one with the passed pawn here. Because the white knight does have to blockade, and obviously his own little 3-on-2 majority is not necessarily effective here. It's been rendered ineffective by the fact that this a7 pawn is a backward pawn. Don't ever forget about en passant, kids. Remember, that pawn can't push. Just joking. I know you all know that, but it's always fun. Although I did have a student who was much better than the level you would have expected to forget about en passant, who forgot that by creating this similar sort of structure, he forgot about en passant and actually allowed his opponent to create a passed pawn and went on to lose the game. It's a long story. We don't want to talk about it. It was ugly. So anyway, back to this current position. White is much better here for two reasons. One, he has the passed pawn, and two, black's kingside pawns are overextended. But the technique here is really, really instructive because other than that, the difference between this position and just about all the other principle of two weaknesses positions we've done is that white has no other advantages here. Okay, he's got the passed pawn, but it is blockaded by a very good knight, and we always know how effective those blockades are, especially the fact that it's on a dark square, so the bishop can't attack it. He has a pawn, but it's blockaded, and he's not up any material, and his only other advantage is the fact that black's pawns are overextended on the king's side, but it's not even really clear how those pawns can be won or targeted. In fact, after we attack the g4 pawn, likely he'll be able to play h5 and then quickly bring his king up to at least, h6, where the king can defend the pawn. So the chances of us winning material at least quickly on the king side is not very high. But I meant what I said. White is not only better here. White is in fact much better. And now that I've given you that whole talk, and I think we were focusing mainly on the principal two weaknesses, let me tell you why white is much better here. Because it really has to do with the bishop versus the knight. Okay, number one. You've probably heard this about bishop versus knight, but I think this is one of the most important things. The first person to create a passed pawn is generally better in an endgame anyway. Even in rook endgames, even other endgames, I think what's funny is that sometimes you see books and teachers talk so much about rook endgames or the knight versus the bishop versus knight, the obstacle bishops. Well, all that stuff is good in terms of the pieces, but what usually ends up deciding the game in the end is who had the better pawn structure anyway. I mean, who has more weaknesses? Who's worse? Who has a worse pawn structure? Who's the first person to get past pawns? So it all comes back to those pawns. Now, I'm not saying we can't learn to maneuver our pieces and understand the little idiosyncrasies that each of them have so that we can get better at it. But bottom line, if you have a better pawn structure, large amounts of material aside, if you have a better pawn structure, you're probably better. So the fact that white has the first pass pawn is critical here, and especially because the bishop outplays the knight typically as soon as pass pawns start to become a part of the game. Because the bishop's ability to transfer to both sides is so good and quick. When a knight is stuck to guarding a passed pawn, whether it be in the center or on the side of the board, it's generally a real disadvantage for the knight. So number one, I think the first person to create a passed pawn typically is better. The second thing that's very important about the bishop is that the bishop does very well when there's pawns on both sides of the board. Now, in turn, I will say that if we were talking about an endgame, I know I'm kind of rambling here, but hopefully you're going to jot down some of these points and apply them to other knight and bishop lectures and endgames. But to stay on point here, the knight's advantage over the bishop may be even bigger than the bishop's advantage over the knight if you're talking about pawns on only one side of the board. The knight's ability to maneuver and switch colors, go from light to dark, and make a pawn push, and then switch to the other color, and now he can attack that pawn because it's on a different color, and etc., etc. The knight's ability to maneuver, if there are only targets on one side of the board, will typically decide a game. But in positions where there are targets on both sides of the board, the bishop's advantage over the knight is huge because the bishop's ability to create one thing, help his pass pawn push while stopping your pass pawn from pushing, etc. These sort of things that the bishop does very well. So I think as soon as pass pawns start to create it, the bishop has an advantage. With pawns on both sides of the board, the bishop typically has an advantage, and again, with pawns on one side of the board, the knight has an advantage. But talking about why white is better here, those two main things, the pawns being on both sides of the board and the fact that white already has a passed pawn, even with this bishop kind of being like a big, ugly step pawn just defending his brother, really not serving any other purpose at this point, white is still much better. So, enough rambling for me. We haven't even made a move yet, but hopefully you're enjoying this. Okay, so after bishop d3, black starts to bring the king forward, which is, pretty obviously the best. Sorry, h5. Pretty obviously the best. And now white has a choice. He could try to go to h4 and focus on, only targeting the pawn. But after king h6, I'm not sure where his progress would be after that. In fact, if the bishop tried to go anywhere to this diagonal to create nonsense, what do we call this, ladies and gentlemen? We call that checkmate. So, I mean, bringing the king to h4 was a bad idea. White doesn't even think about it, brings the king to f4, and now we reach our first critical stage of the game. Up to this point, I've done a lot of talking. I've kind of given you some ideas of why the bishop is better than the knight here, despite the fact that black has a very, very nice blockade. Also given you some foreshadowing about why the bishop will be able to outplay the knight here. The fact that there are things on both sides of the board, it's just now up to you to figure out what the right plan is. And also sort of alluded to what our second weakness will be. Even though we have this first advantage of the passed pawn, there should be a way to create targets and create an advantage on this king side of the board where our king has a slight space advantage over the black king. So there should be a way to do that. Let's see if you can find what the best move is here. Okay, we're going to assume you looked, and we're going to assume that you're a genius, and you found h3, exclam. When you're better, I guess trading pieces doesn't always pop into your head as the number one choice, or at least it shouldn't, because you want to find a way to grind and outplay your opponent without just liquefying. I mean, unless you're up serious amounts of material, trading pieces doesn't always help. But in this scenario, white is unable to even create threats against these pawns unless at least a pair of them comes off the board. So h3 was critical. Hopefully you guys found this idea. It's actually probably the only real way to make progress. And now black plays knight f7, which is key. Because he's pointing out to the fact that not only can he wait, he can go back and forth and remind white that he is keeping an eye on this pawn. But by going to f7, he also has other things in mind. You know, if this king tried to come over or forgot about this, the knight would come to g5. Obviously, you know, getting careless in some other way might allow the knight to get active to e5. So by bringing the knight to f7, black is basically saying, all right, what do you got, big guy? I mean, I'm defending. I've got a nice king position. My knight has very safe dark squares where your bishop can't even bother me. And if you even go to e2, I'm going to go back to d6. You're going to go back to d3, and I'm going to go back to f7. So where's your cards, right? Well, this is kind of the final climax, and this is something that I could actually do an entire video series on. It's an advanced even phrase. The phrase is advanced. Probably most of you haven't heard of it. And it's an advanced idea in terms of how the bishop outplays the knight. Beyond those basic tips of pawns on both sides of the board or pass pawns and the obvious things that may decide who's better anyway. An actual technique the bishop can use to outplay the knight is what we call the triple step method. I learned it by my coach at the time, Grandmaster Yermolinsky. He actually was the one who instructed me on this position. I have many positions to sort of execute this little advantage the bishop has over the knight, and that is the knight can switch colors, right? So this is a huge advantage when maneuvering and when trying to create weaknesses. That's why we talked about that one side of the board thing, the knight's ability to maneuver. And I've even seen the knight beat the bishop when you have knight in 4 versus bishop in 4. You know, just the fact that the knight has that maneuvering ability and outplaying ability. But the disadvantage is the knight only goes to 2 squares, meaning like, what I mean is, okay, the knight went to f7, but if I was to, let's say, move this bishop to f1, you couldn't make a random move with the knight and still be able to go back to d6. If I went here and attacked your pawn, you would have already committed your knight to a situation where at least it's not as good as it was on d6. So the point is, the bishop has the ability to wait more than 2 squares on a diagonal, whereas the knight, you know, when it's blockading in these situations, oftentimes has no choice but to go back and forth. So what we call this here is the triple step method. The knight goes to f7, the bishop goes to f1. We have 3 squares. Very simply, if the knight goes back to d6, now we can go to e2. Excuse me, hold on one sec. If the knight goes back to e6, now you can go to e2, and black is in zugzwang. Either A, he moves the knight, which will allow us to take the pawn because the knight is only not here anymore, or he moves the king to either e7, which lets us in, or to g6, which lets us in. Let me review what we just did there so you really get the point. So we started out in this position where progress was unclear. Even after playing h3 and opening the diagonal, progress was unclear because black was going to wait, and whenever we were going to attack the pawn, he was going to go back and attack our pawn, either d6 or e5. But by making this triple step method, it's an advanced form of zugzwang, which is what it is. I want you to say it out loud to yourself, all across the world. We can hear everyone hearing it. Ready? Triple step method. Did you hear that through your windows? There's a lot of people watching these videos right now. There's like thousands of them, okay? Because I'm really popular. I'm just joking. Stay with me, okay? That was just a joke. Seriously. All right. But seriously, say it to yourself. Triple step method. Advanced form of zugzwang. It's the way the bishop outplays the knight. The knight has these 2 squares as options when it comes to holding a blockade, and that's it. Whereas the bishop can have sometimes at least 3 squares, and sometimes more than that, depending on how long the diagonal is. But the bishop makes a waiting move, and after the knight goes back to d6, now goes to e2, which is actually, by the way, bishop here is not creating a threat. But it is creating a threat because what's that called? Zugzwang. The knight either has to move, which gives us the pawn, or the king has to move, which gives us king entry, which maybe even, you know, lead to a quicker win than actually winning the pawn. So you see why its executable idea here is based on this triple step method, which is kind of why I said this position could be considered a bishop versus knight lecture or a principle of 2 weaknesses. Okay, so black anticipated this, and after white played bishop to f1, After h3 takes, knight f7, bishop f1. Black did not go back to d6. He went back to e5. So the blockade is shifting. White played bishop e2, and now he has to go to g6 check, only move. You should note that if black did try to play h4 instead of knight to g6 check, even something as simple as let's see, we'll do a couple moves here. Even something as simple as just moving the bishop again, it might be good enough, because either the knight or the king will have to move, and either one allows me to come close to the h-pawn, or if the king moves, I win the knight. And don't forget, black can't even get a little frisky. He can't get too frisky because we do have this passed d-pawn here. So, instead, knight g6 check is played, and White first tried king to e4, which is funny because all they did was repeat moves. But eventually White came around and realized that the only way to get the right form of Zugzwang here, after king e4, for example, after knight g6 check, king e4, knight e5 just repeats the position. And if White tries to get a form of Zugzwang with king to e3, Black would be able to play. I'm sorry, we have the black here. Black will be able to activate his king. Now, if black goes back to f4 and tries to go to e3 first, which is a nice idea because if the knight goes back to e5, he's repeating the position, except now it's black to move. The problem there is that after king to e3, knight to e5, king e4, even knight f7 is still holding the position somewhat. Because if bishop takes h5, the knight goes to g5 check and wins the h3 pawn. So, I kind of rambled there, but let me make sure you're on the same page with me. White did indeed execute this triple step method to force the knight to come to e5 instead of having his happy little blockade there where everybody was defended. Now, at the very least, his position is slightly more precarious because the king has to defend the knight, and the knight has to stay on e5 in order to do this. Whenever you start to create these sort of multiple musts for your opponent, like he must have the king there, he must have this there, must have that there, that's a little clue that one of my mentors gave me. Whenever you can start to make a list of multiple musts for your opponent, you're doing a good job. You're breaking down their blockade. When their blockade is as simple as 1, 2, 3, then you're not doing it right. So even though we haven't quite figured out how to break this down, which I'm going to show you, at the very least we've made some progress here. But like I'm saying, if the king tries to go to e3, the knight goes to, if the king tries to go to e3 in this situation, you'd be allowing me to come forward, and we'd probably do a simple repeat of the moves. If you go back to f4 and I repeat the position and you try to trick me with with king to e3, getting king to e4 with my move, well, you haven't even really made that much progress because your pawn's on h3. So my point is that White doesn't really have a very obvious way to put black in Zugzwang. However, he eventually came around to the fact that after knight g6 check, he had this move, king to g3, a move that White didn't consider right away because he was worried about the idea of letting the king in. However, if you calculate, you'll notice that king e5, bishop takes, threatens the knight. A move like this would be forced, and White realizes pretty fast that Black would have to give up his knight for the pawn, and likely this bishop will be able to handle this guy, and this pawn will be able to get a queen. So Black is not really able to activate his king because of our protected passed pawn, which again is a wonderful advantage. I love protected passed pawns. So after king to g3, Black continues to maintain the blockade for at least one more move, knight to e5. But now, finally, we make our commitment, which is, by the way, the only real way to break down this blockade. It should be noted that king to h4, knight g6 check is played anyway. You can't even take this pawn because of the fork on the king and bishop. So eventually, by either, however you want to look at it, by trial and error, process of elimination, White realizes that the other king maneuvers were not able to force Zugzwang. He'd already improved his bishop to the maximum square with that triple step method, which made Black's knight go to an annoying square. And so finally he reached a point where he had no choice but to take the risk, make a sacrifice of the pawn in order to create this outside pass pawn. What's fun about this is, get ready, people. This endgame's only getting started. Don't even think I'm letting you go that easy with this bonus video. What's funny about this is now we end up heading to a new, completely different type of position where we're still dealing with a bishop versus knight, but now we're dealing with really a more traditional prince of two weaknesses where we have an obvious advantage for one side, that being the outside pass pawn. and an obvious potential for second weaknesses, which would be to take advantage of the pawns over here. So now we're going to see where White's technique really plays the part, and he does a very good job of balancing the threat of advancing the pawn combined with the threat of rushing over to win the other advantages. I always tell my kids who are understanding just basic king and pawn endgames, imagine if we just took these guys off. When kids are first starting out, even these positions are a little bit of a struggle. But you try to teach them the little candy bar, big candy bar. Anybody who has brothers, I have 3 brothers, and they all beat me up. So, it's, one of them's younger, and, he can probably beat me up too. But that's why it's easy to understand if you have brothers, like the little candy bar and the big candy bar. So all you're doing, it's like a little decoy thing they can understand. You just give them the little one so that when they get it, you can hide the big one and your parents don't even know, and then you can go win all the other candy bars. You feel what I'm saying? Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. So that's a little phrase I like to use. So in this position, White played King F5, Knight to D7. We're going to see the little candy bar, big candy bar executed to perfection. Bishop F3, Knight B8, Bishop to B7. Nice, very nice. After the knight goes back to D7, Black has set up kind of the next form of his blockade, where he looks like everything's cute and dandy, and the pawns are still on dark squares, which, if those pawns were on light squares, this entire endgame might be a little bit easier. But any time you're dealing with an endgame where your opponent has managed to put all of his pawns on the opposite color squares of your bishop, it takes a little bit more technique than you would have liked, but, hey, that's life. So H4 was played, Knight to F6 was played, Bishop back to F3, Knight back to D7, White plays H5, Black plays Knight B8, not talking too much yet because there really isn't a need, H6 and King G8, and obviously, Black really can't wait that much longer. If he did indeed try to move the knight one more time, you'd run into Bishop D5 check. And after King to F8, either King to E6, where the knight will eventually be trapped, or even ideas where you can try to push the pawn first and do it. So, and of course, it should be noted if you go this way, you're just away from the pawn. So Black now had to commit to King to G8, and White simply played King E6, King H7, and King to D6, followed by the win of the knight, and Black resigned. Actually, what's interesting is the most accurate move, instead of even king up, was actually this move first, completely preventing any crazy chances, because of the fact that even if you push the a pawn, I can en passant. What I'm saying is that if King C7 was played, it's possible that A5 might be considered, with the idea being that White barely gets back in time to guard the pawn. However, barely schmerely, right? He still gets back to guard the pawn and wins the game. Okay, so in review, what did we cover today? We talked about, starting from our halfway point here where White's advantage was clear, very simple execution of using your outside pass pawn, the little candy bar, to go and win the big candy bar, very basic decoy tactics. Doing that with style and technique, making sure you don't miss any stupid tactics is always important. When you're winning, the worst thing you can do is miss a tactic. But to start out, what we were dealing with was a position where White's advantage was minimal at best, and in fact, like I said, I've given this position to 1,800 players and stronger who even debated who was better, because the knight looks so good here. But the point was that this passed pawn, without anybody to really help the knight in his blockade, or to target this pawn, this passed pawn was a protected passed pawn, and those are killers. Your enemy guy, your opponent can never get rid of them, and he can't ever leave them because it is a passed pawn. So that advantage allowed White to be aggressive with the kingside pawns, to make the progress that he did, open up the diagonals. The triple step method is absolutely critical and one of my favorite little examples of why the bishop outplays the knight. Because Black's blockading ability is based on only 2 squares, whereas the bishop has an advantage of being able to move more than that. You'll see that technique in a lot of endgames. You can look it up. In fact, I think the Dvoretsky endgame manual executes several different examples where the triple step method where the bishop outplays the knight. So when that happened, Black was smart enough to be aggressive with his blockade. However, when White eventually figured out the right idea to come to G3 and play D6, Black was in an impossible situation trying to guard an outside pass pawn and the big candy bar at the same time. So good principle, two weaknesses. Really fun bonus video. Hopefully, God, I'm tongue twisted today. Hopefully you enjoyed the bishop versus knight commentary, and hopefully we've improved your knowledge of some of the little things people think about there, some of the things people overrate, and some of the things people forget. But more to come on that topic, I'm sure, and hope you enjoyed the lecture. So this concludes our video series on the Principle of Two Weaknesses with Chess.com, and have a wonderful, wonderful chess journey. Goodbye.